How many times has this happened to you? You're watching a Deltarune video or reading a comment on social media, and the author says something along the lines of, and in the code there's evidence of X, or the game files prove that Y is true, and you're left with little choice but to just accept these things as true because you're not a coder or a data miner, and even if you have some passing programming knowledge, you wouldn't know where to look to verify what they're saying is true or have the motivation to go through all the effort to disprove it. There are a lot of myths surrounding secrets uncovered by data miners and modders that have spread poorly like a game of telephone, because most of the people who make these claims aren't the ones who've looked into it themselves. My goal in this video is to solidly prove and disprove these myths as needed with direct evidence from the game files in an easy to understand way to help stop the spread of some of the misinformation and hopefully serve as a resource to point to when it's being spread. To that end, if there's anything at all you think I've missed, please leave a comment so I can investigate. There are already a couple of things that I've left out of this video because it was getting way too long, so part 2 will definitely be coming. Huge shoutouts to the Underminers Discord and all the contributors to the Undertale Mod Tool, without whom this video would be completely impossible. And if you have any interest in data mining or modding GameMaker games, head over there ASAP. Let's jump right into it, starting with the most common example of data mining bait. Unused, the voice in the code. When the survey program was released, it didn't take long before the community started scouring the game's files. The voice in the code is a prominent name now for the speaker of these infamous lines, but in the initial release of the survey program, and still in Chapter 1, you don't actually need to view the game's code to read these lines. They're present in the English language file, lang_en.json, readable in Notepad or similar. This changed in Chapter 2, where the common practice for Deltarune became hard-coding the English language text lines into the code itself, only pulling from an external file when translating the game to Japanese. I won't read them all aloud, they're easy to find online, and I bet a fair few of you practically know them by heart already. Let's dig into the stuff you probably don't know. Coming back to the English language file from the survey program, this brings us to what I believe to be the first misconception, or slightly misleading trait of these lines, and that is the reference to them as unused. If you open that file and search for unused, you'll find lines labeled unused/unused GML 1 through 10_0. This name has meaning in reference to Deltarune's code. Let's look at another file name, for example. That is just a bunch of gibberish, written in an easier way to read, that is object Susie Bad Guy event /step 0 line ID 30. Object is the type, which is usually either object or script, and refers to the next part of the name, which is the name of the either object or script which uses the line of dialogue. Of note, object is equivalent to the all caps device and process, which I'll get into in a future section. After the slash, if the type is an object, the name will include which part of the object's code the line appears in. I'll put when each part of the code is called on screen, pause if you're interested, but it's not super important for this point. If it's a script, then the part after the slash just repeats the first part. Then there's the line number, which when combined with a previous identifier gives a unique line notation that can be referred to elsewhere in the code to retrieve this exact line from the language file. TLDR, the name of the line of dialogue tells us where it's going to be used. Let's go back to our unused line. Unused/unused GML 10. So what does this name tell us? Well, it doesn't have an object or a script type, so it's used in neither an object nor script, but could this still be referring to part of the code? GML global script unused. This is where the dialogue is used, in a function called unused in a file called GML global script unused, which assigns the lines of text to the variables named unused_0 through 9, variables which go, predictably, unused. This is obviously why these lines from the voice in the language files are referred to as unused, because they're labeled as unused about 100 times, and there's no way for them to render as text in the game. But in the strictest sense of the word, they're not really unused. They are deliberately usable by the rest of the code. I could write a mod that calls the unused function, and while nothing would happen in-game, the text would really be loaded into memory, theoretically. It might get optimized out by the compiler or ignored for any other reason, but I would be asking the game to load the text. Calling them unused to me implies that there was some other intended use for these lines, like an interaction that was cut from development or something along those lines, when really these lines are being used for their intended purpose, to convey a message that only players rooting through the files would be able to find. The message the voice is trying to send, yes, but I think there's a clear message from Toby Fox himself, that secrets are being hidden outside of the game, and that there's more to find, so let's find them. Now that I've certainly scared off the majority of the viewers with how densely I'm covering these topics, you might have noticed a pretty big jump in audio quality since my last videos. hopefully assuming I haven't royally fucked up. This video and the last one, the Friends Determination video, took a massive amount of time to research and fact check and double and triple check, and still stuff certainly has slipped through. I do these videos purely as a hobby, and it's a hobby that's put me back in the red after buying a new microphone, if that's any indication of how ad rates are for YouTube videos of my reach. I don't really play the algorithm game. I make these videos because they're a fun hobby, and I don't mind investing my own cash into a hobby I enjoy. So I'm immensely grateful that these videos so far have had such a response that they can help feed into themselves and improve the overall experience for y'all. To that end, I'd really like to be able to continue justifying spending all the extra time and effort these sort of deep nitty-gritty videos take. I want to make these videos better, and whether that means non-free editing software, taking editing courses, or enlisting some help so that it's not just me working on this stuff, it takes money that I'll probably pay anyways. But if you feel like helping out, and really truly only if you really want to and can afford to, I've started a Patreon and I've turned on YouTube memberships. I don't plan on locking any content behind it or doing any early member releases or anything like that. I already shared little progress updates on videos and what I'm working on in the Discords, and I won't stop doing that. So it's really just if you like the stuff I make and want to see me make more, better stuff, then it's there to support me and see those updates in a less ephemeral place than in a Discord server. Otherwise, I'm incredibly grateful to anyone who just watches these videos that I make, so let's get back to the fun code stuff. The Toriel Variable. Jumping ahead to Chapter 3. If you already know what a variable is, you can skip ahead 20 seconds. But a super quick programming 101 is that a variable is a named container for some value, and you can put some data into a variable like a number or a string of characters, give it a name, and then ask for that data back later using the name you decided on. Then you can do whatever you want with that data, like perform a math operation or make comparisons with other data by referring to it by your chosen name. Importantly, it's programming best practice to use variables whose names make it clear to someone who's reading the code what the data contained within it is. For example, here's the base list of variables which every enemy on one of the S-rank boards has. Speed, move direction, max HP, whether or not it's currently aggressive. Sometimes, a variable's name can be ambiguous though. MoveCon, for instance, would be hard to discern its purpose without looking through the code, where you can work out that it's a rolling counter that keeps track of which part of the enemy's movement pattern the enemy currently is in. MoveCon's variable name is ambiguous due to the complexity of its purpose. Quick tangent that maybe no one other than me would find interesting. I was curious about why MoveCon was the variable name chosen. I already know from looking through the code that con is the frequently used name for this sort of variable which iterates upwards as the game moves objects through states. But con didn't seem short for anything sensible to me, with the closest that came to mind being condition. Well, it turns out if you go digging through the Undertale code, some of the very earliest examples of this sort of state-changing programming pattern that Toby used is in the earliest dialogue sequences in the Ruins. These sequences, where normally a con variable would be used, instead uses a variable conversation. So presumably what happened is that Toby quickly started shortening conversation to con and the even shorter CN, and then when similar patterns cropped up later in Undertale that weren't necessarily conversation-based, like picking out music in Napster Blue's house, he kept using con as a variable name to keep the purpose clear for himself, even if what it stands for no longer really made sense. So this variable is technically named MoveConversation, but it really is just a naming holdover from some of the very earliest things that Toby Fox programmed for Undertale. Sorry, that was me in real time writing that into the script as I worked out the answer to that mystery. Why else would a variable be ambiguous other than the purpose being difficult to fully explain in a reasonable length name? Well, sometimes it's just bad practice. Let's play a game. What is this variable for? If your guess was, it's how the Balthazard randomly distributes the damage of its incense cloud attack, then you're right. Any other answer is wrong, sorry. I call this bad practice, but in reality, especially for variables that are only used in one specific spot like this, it's incredibly common to name them something generic that doesn't give much away. What's less common but still prevalent is variables that are ambiguous because they're a joke or pop culture reference. For example, the "you're a boss" variable, which is used during the saving process, which records whether you've defeated the super bosses of any given chapter to your save file. So what does it mean when a variable is none of these? When a variable's name doesn't tell us what it does, yet it clearly is not a placeholder like X or foobar, when it's not making a joke and yet its function couldn't be more clear. And what if that function is to basically do nothing? Or at least do nothing in a way that could have been done in a much simpler way than including lines of code that equate to a useless machine that turns itself off at the flip of a switch. It means that there's some other intent behind the variable and the code it's a part of. We already know from the message left by the unused dialogue that Toby Fox has left us secrets to find by digging through the game's files. And this unassuming variable named Toriel is my personal favorite. There are a lot of moving parts to this one, so let's take it one step at a time. In the third S-rank board, there are a series of individual rooms with monsters inside that seem to represent different hometowners. You can draw parallels to some character relationships in Undertale, while others see ties to the hometown Deltarune's layout according to the popular roots theory from Gold Pro. One room in particular is a bit more uncanny. When you walk into this room, across an unpassable abyss is a pitch-black monster sprite, in the shape identical to those that are most closely analogous to Asgore and Toriel. This monster directly mirrors every move that you make as Mini Kris. Attempting to attack across the chasm reveals the monster to be invincible, and the only way to defeat it is to maneuver the monster onto a switch on their side of the chasm as Kris stands on the switch of their own. The chasm disappears, and from then on, Kris remains stationary, and you control the monster itself until it comes within a certain distance of Kris, at which point Kris strikes the monster with no input from the player, who then regains control of Kris. So where does this variable called Toriel come into play? Well, let's observe what happens when I remove one single line from the logic which handles the spawning of enemies on the S-rank board. The black sprite is now in the shape of a deer, complete with animations and left-right facing logic. This requires no additions to the code, just the removal of one line setting the Toriel variable to true, but one other thing has changed as a result. Now, it is possible to strike the deer with Kris's sword, and you can see if I freeze frame it that the sprite flashing is the hurt sprite from its normal monster sprite. So what exactly is going on here? Let's take a look. If you remember the base list of variables which every enemy has, which I showed earlier, monsters on the S-rank boards also have a list of variables that are specific to each one of them. Like here in the lizard enemy's create script, it sets its HP to 2, its speed to 5, and a whole bunch of other stuff related to its specific logic. So which one of these create scripts initializes the monster that mirrors our movement? It's this one, OBJ board enemy black deer create 0. And here is where we see the origin of the Toriel variable. We can see the natural state of the Toriel variable is false. So that one line we removed, which was called every time one of these monsters was created, set the Toriel variable to be true. Now we know what created the Toriel variable and where it was turned on. What exactly does that change? Well, there are two places in the code which check to see whether Toriel is true or false. The first is in the Black Deer Step 2 script. Once all of the movement logic is done, at the very bottom of the file, the script looks at which way Kris is facing. Then it picks the black deer sprite which matches the opposite facing, creating the mirrored sprite flipping. Then the code tries to pick the hurt sprite accordingly and assigns a brighter deer sprite to create a matching animation for being hit, but I believe there was a mistake on the programmer's part here. It's supposed to check for sprite board deer R and L black, but instead, it looks for sprites without the underscore black at the end. Adding underscore black to the end of each of these checks results in the hurt sprite animation playing properly, otherwise there is no situation where these hurt sprites would be properly assigned, so I'm fairly confident that this is a bug that understandably never got caught, because it can only occur after we've already removed a line of code, remember. And then, we reach the end of the script. After doing all of that work determining which way Kris faces and loading the correct sprite, the game asks the Toriel variable whether it is true or false. If Toriel is true, which in the normal course of gameplay it always is, it reassigns the sprite to the sprite board monster black and the hurt sprite to the corresponding hurt sprite. If it's false, the sprites are left as is. Side note, in our little mod of the game, Toriel is set to false, so the hurt sprite should never have had a chance to be assigned to the original unfixed version, right? So why are we seeing the base monster hurt sprite flashing in the first version? Remember the base list of variables again? One of the default values is the hurt sprite, and the default is again the sprite board monster hurt sprite. So despite it never being manually assigned, with nothing else to fall back on, it happens to still result in the same sprite as the base games, despite it technically originating from a different place now. Getting back on track, this bit of code is what I was referring to when I brought up the useless machines. The code at the bottom of this file serves worse than no purpose. Every frame, the game goes through this process of picking a sprite that will never be seen, only to immediately shut the box on itself and revert to the goat monster sprite. This is worse than useless from a purely functional perspective. In-game, it would be completely functionally equivalent if the deer's create script just assigned sprite board monster black and sprite board monster hurt, and you would be saving programming cycles by skipping logic checks, memory by not loading in an extra handful of sprites, and human lifespan by not having someone write code that's extraneous and purposeless. So logically, the only reason for this code to exist is if someone wanted us to find it. To see that this enemy could instead be seen as a black deer, and it being so useless from a programming perspective, is what makes it clear that it doesn't fall under the umbrella of cut or unused content. Because if it was, it'd have just been deleted in the first place. It's a hint to give us confidence that this is an intentional secret to be found that has meaning to be interpreted. Where else is this Toriel variable checked? It's checked at the top of the Black Deer's Step 0 script. There is a check at the very beginning of the script which determines whether Kris's sword should be able to make contact with and damage the Black Deer monster. This check is looking at two variables at once, the nebulous Toriel variable and the controlled variable, which is set to true when the player takes control of the Black Deer monster. The check reads like this: if we aren't in control of the Black Deer, Kris's attack should only work if Toriel is set to false. So that line that we deleted earlier, which sets Toriel to true and changes the sprite to the goat monster, is what protects that monster and prevents Kris from attacking it, until we are no longer in control of Kris. Again, this code would be much simpler if the Toriel variable was simply removed, and there would be no observable difference in game. Just check if control is true, and if so, allow the collision detection. That, my friends, is the extent of what the Toriel variable does. Now, some of the misinformation I've seen spread is any relation to the other semi-deer related board enemy, the White Hood. The Toriel variable has absolutely nothing to do with this monster, and in fact, the non-black deer sprite is much closer, in my opinion, to actually unused content. There is no code that references this sprite. Turning Toriel true or false does not reveal a deer underneath. This sprite is connected to the White Hood, but its connections are looser than the Black Deer connection. For one, the White Hooded character's name in the code is OBJ board enemy deer, which is mirrored by the sprite's name, sprite board deer L and R. However, unlike the Black Deer, which in the object's definition uses the Black Deer sprite, the White Hood's default sprite is still the familiar White Hood sprite. There is a place where sprite board deer R is used, but it's only viewable in the Undertale Mod Tool, and it's here, in the object definition of the enemy spawner. You can see it has sprites for all of the monsters listed, and while the sprite isn't used in-game, each instance of an enemy spawner, when viewed in the room viewer, displays the sprite corresponding to which monster is spawned, and the White Hood spawner is this basic deer sprite. Onto some speculation time. What does it all mean? I've given a more significant breakdown of what I think in terms of theorizing in the second Soul Possession video, but in summary, I think these are the important points that these bits of code are pointing at. The Black Deer represents Death, and the normal deer represents Noelle. The White Hood has ice magic, wears a white hood, freezes a bird, and follows Kris, all traits that Noelle shares. That and the deer thing. Death makes the most sense as the counterpart, since she's got the dark, edgy goth vibe based on her room, and her whereabouts are shrouded in darkness. It could be another holiday, but I'd expect a Carol deer to be blue or white in color, and a Rudy deer to have some indication of his illness. Toriel both is hiding something related to deaths and is protecting or has protected deaths in the past. The variable bearing her name is what obscures the true form of the Black Deer, and it stops Kris from hurting it. What and why that could be is a total mystery. There is some soul fuckery going on with deaths. The Black Deer is the only thing we directly control outside of the board mini version of Kris, and we're explicitly shown the soul as being the method through which mini Kris is controlled. Likewise, the soul then controls the Black Deer, and given the opportunity, prioritizes controlling Deaths over controlling Kris. Is that representing some past event where Deaths was possessed by a soul? I think so, but that's well into the realm of speculation, and I'd be retreading the second Soul Possession video ground. Kris, at some point, tried to harm Deaths, and perhaps succeeded, or sees himself harming Deaths in the future and acts on their current opportunity. Completely separated from our control, mini Kris strikes down Deaths at the first opportunity. Is this a manifestation of Kris's potentially violent tendencies? Or Kris in the present trying to keep us from learning something about the Black Deer monster, just like they tried to keep us out of the shelter? Questions. But that's finally all for the Toriel variable. Let's look at something else Kris violence related. Kris's damage. Kris's damage is commonly known to fluctuate in two situations, versus Tenna and versus the Roaring Knight. How exactly does this work? Against Tenna, Kris deals massively increased damage if they've completed the sword route. That's a well-known piece of trivia, but did you know that Kris actually deals substantially less damage to Tenna if the sword route hasn't been completed, even compared to normal enemies? Check out the code here. In a normal save file, Kris will deal 50% of their normal damage to Tenna if the sword route hasn't been completed, versus 300% damage if it has. That's based on this did Kris do sword route variable, which is set to the value of this global flag 1050. The global flags are a long list of variables that constitute all of the events, states, etc. that would be saved to your save file, and can be referred to at any later time. You can find lists online and in the Underminers Discord of all the different flags, but I found the most effective way to understand what these individual flags do is to examine the code itself. So let's do that for 1050. As you can see here, Flag 1050 is set right at the beginning of the outro cutscene that plays after beating the Shadow Mantle fight. The exact timing of this is important because many of the people will attribute Kris's damage bonus to Kris being angry with Tenna, following Tenna revealing that he had conspired with Kris prior to the Shadow Mantle fight. But as is evident by when the flag is set, it's possible for that conversation to play, Kris fight and lose the fight against the Shadow Mantle, then give up and move on to the end of the chapter and fight Tenna. If you were to do so, Kris is still hesitating to attack Tenna and deals the reduced 50% damage output, even though the player would have witnessed Tenna spilling all their secrets. So, assuming the timing of the flag being switched isn't a development oversight, which it very well could be, instead we'd have to assume that there's something to this conversation which spurs Kris on to fight. The Shadow Mantle holder is clearly inciting Kris's violent tendencies before and after the fight, so it could be a manifestation of that, or it could be the result of coming to own the Shadow Mantle itself for some reason, as acquiring the Shadow Mantle is a required part of the rest of the sequence. There's no way to dodge picking up the Shadow Mantle after that flag is set to true. But if it were due to the Shadow Mantle, I think it would be more likely for the developers to make use of the script armor check inventory function, which is used by the hidden Tenna Spamton cutscene to determine if the player has either of the Spamton boss items and choose which cutscene to play based on whether they have either or not. In short, assuming there aren't any mistakes in the code, which is a fairly large assumption, seeing as I've pointed out some code that I believe is already a mistake once in this video, it's likely that it's Kris's conversation with the Shadow Mantle holder, which results in Kris dealing 6 times as much damage as a non-sword route run. Let's move on to the Knight. First off, the Roaring Knight has a base amount of damage resistance that applies to all of the Fun Gang's attacks, which is separate from the Knight's defense. At the beginning of the fight, every character's damage output is reduced to 20% of their normal value. Then with each turn that passes, they regain a flat 1% of their damage, up to a maximum of 35% at 15 turns. After that damage reduction is applied, it moves onto the Kris step. First off, just like against Tenna, with no other factors, Kris is dealing 50% of their normal damage output. Already that implies the Knight and Tenna are on the same level of Kris's hesitancy to harm, as without any other influence, Kris is pretty heavily pulling their punches against both of them and by the exact same amount. Most of the time I see Kris's damage increase against the Knight mentioned, it's only mentioned that their damage is high when both Susie and Ralsei are down. But in fact, if either Ralsei or Susie are reduced to below 0 HP, Kris will return to their normal damage output, losing that 50% multiplier, effectively doubling the damage they're dealing to the Knight. If the second party member goes down, that doubles again, resulting in a 200% total damage output from Kris before the Knight's innate scaling damage reduction is applied. It's still lower than the 300% damage Kris deals to Tenna post sword route, but it's still a lot of damage for their regular attacks. You might be surprised to know that these aren't the first times Kris has pulled their punches in a fight. All the way back in Chapter 1, very similar looking code is used to reduce Kris and Ralsei's damage output to 30% when targeting Susie in the versus Susie and Lancer fight. Could that be Kris and Ralsei's reluctance to harm Susie for real? Or maybe, like the Knight's innate damage resistance, it represents the hardiness of Lightners and their resilience against attacks in the Dark Worlds? It's probably not the latter, since Burley takes full damage from the gang's attacks, and if it is the former, then damn, they must really hate Burley after all. The only damage reduction going on in Chapter 2 is when Spamton Neo's defense increases at the end of the Weird Route solo fight. Chapter 4 features a little bit of damage multiplier fuckery as well, but it's mostly against the Titan and the Titan spawn. The Titan obviously goes through phases of natural damage reduction based on whether you've exposed its weak point, but when the Black Shard is equipped, Kris always gets a massive damage multiplier regardless, making attacking the Titan even with its shields up quite effective. But look at that, there's a curious check right here, indicating that another piece of equipment would grant the same damage increase. I wonder what that could be. It's the Twisted Sword, bringing another code-based urban legend somewhat full circle, a legend that I'll probably have to get to in part 2. The device naming scheme. In Deltarune's codebase, there are 2 distinct ways files are named. The vast majority of assets and resources use an all, or mostly all, lowercase naming scheme, with a prefix that determines what type of resource it is. The important ones are OBJ for game objects, room for rooms, SPR for sprites, and SND for sounds. Files with this naming scheme encapsulate the entirety of everything that appears in the light and dark worlds, with seldom few exceptions. Even all of the objects on Tenna's game board follow this format, just with board included as part of the prefix, such as obj board bridge. Where it gets interesting is with resources that aren't associated with the light world or dark world. These are the assets associated with the Goner Maker sequence: save file menus, title screens, game overs, and the dog check, which is the screen which appears when trying to access inaccessible rooms. With these resources, the normal prefixes are replaced in the following ways. OBJ becomes device or process, room becomes place, SPR becomes image, and S&D becomes audio, with all of the new names being in all caps. So for instance, the room which contains the game over screen is called place failure, and the handler for the vessel creation sequence is device Goner Maker. Generally, any of the resources associated with the aforementioned categories follow this all caps naming scheme with the alternate prefixes. It's not 100% consistent. For example, most of the resources associated with the chapter select follow the lowercase naming of the light world and dark world assets, but generally this pattern is followed pretty strongly. There is an exception, and that is friend. In Chapter 2, friend has two associated resources: image friend, which is handled by device friend, referring to a sprite and a game object respectively. In Chapter 4, we get image friend and image friend W, which appear in the Church Dark World and in the Batat minigame respectively. In Chapter 3, however, friend's appearance does not follow this trend, and instead refers to friend ambiguously and in the lowercase naming scheme. During Ralsei's Dark World Objects lecture, we glimpse sprite nondescript room underscore face and sprite nondescript room underscore laugh. On the first S-rank board, OBJ board sword shadow T's teeth and OBJ board sword shadow T's face can be found, and these game objects utilize the sprites SPR underscore laugh and SPR underscore eyes. And in the fight against the mantle holder, the little friend spawns are simply OBJ underscore with sprite SPR underscore. It's curious that in this specific chapter, friends' resources follow a different naming scheme. The formatting of these names compared to others would imply that the object's name is just underscore or blank, but more likely is that it's some form of censoring of the name. If the all uppercase friend is similar to the uppercase place and device prefixes, it could be the friend is a device layer replacement for friend's real name, which has been censored for in-game or out-of-game reasons. There's a lot to dig into with these file names and all of the implications, so I will once again point you to Molly Stars' device theory videos for the de facto breakdown. They're really good. Really, really good. The Shadow Mantle holder's name. This is a common topic that people will often bring up the code nebulously as evidence of the S-rank board's boss being named Nightmare or ERAM without any real further elaboration. In fact, it's happened in my own YouTube comments, so let's go over how exactly Deltarune's code refers to the Shadow Mantle holder. The most common reference to the mantle holder is simply as Shadow Mantle. Every one of its game objects and sprites uses this formatting for its name, such as OBJ Shadow Mantle Enemy and SPR Shadow Mantle Laugh. The code does not refer to the boss in any other specific way. Even variables in the code use this name, like Shadow Mantle Move. The name Nightmare comes from the raw audio file names for two OST tracks related to the Shadow Mantle boss fight: Nightmare Boss Heavy.ogg and Nightmare NES.ogg. The official names for these tracks on the OST are Burning Eyes and the source of the other most popular fan name for the boss, ERAM. Neither of these names are used in the codebase to refer to the boss. The name ERAM never appears in the code files, and Nightmare only appears as part of the calls to begin those two specific music tracks. In short, the code only ever refers to the boss as Shadow Mantle or Shadow Mantle Enemy. So if that's the primary source you want to use, then that is the boss's name. It's by far the most frequent reference to the boss, but doing so might conflict with the boss stating that it's holding the Shadow Mantle, depending on how you want to read that statement. So if you want to go by the sound files names, then it simply depends on whether you feel that two unofficial track names outweigh one official track name, being Nightmare and ERAM respectively. Either, I think, are equally valid. I personally lead towards ERAM, but that's just to distinguish between it and the Legend of Zelda boss that the mantle holder is a reference to. Kris Preservation Society. This little Easter egg is up there in terms of how promising it sounds. A hidden variable with a name like Kris Preservation Society? That must be important, right? Well, This is one reason why I spent so long in the Toriel Variable section talking about naming variables and the significance behind why you would name certain variables certain ways. Kris Preservation Society is a very important sounding name. It's ominous and shadowy. It's hard not to think that there's some deeper meaning behind it. Unfortunately, the KPS variable really doesn't have a lot going for it other than the name. Unlike the Toriel variable, which is used in multiple places, obscures specific information, has additional assets tied to it, and has a non-negligible amount of code specifically tied to it, the KPS variable just doesn't. Do you remember that example I gave, the random variable A, which does some random little thing? That's the level of programmatic importance that the KPS variable is given. Variable A and variable Kris Preservation Society are both examples of local variables. Without getting too lost in the weeds, we can also call these temporary variables. These are variables which are created within the context of a small chunk of code and then discarded as soon as the task is done. This is in contrast to the Toriel variable, which is perpetually tied to the black deer as an instance variable. From a usability standpoint, that just means that the Toriel variable can be referred to and checked for as long as the black deer monster exists. But the KPS variable only exists for the brief moment that it's used, and the task that it's used for is substantially less impactful than even the Toriel variable's marginal impact on the game. What is its actual use then? The Kris Preservation Society variable is a temporary variable that is assigned the string since chapter X, where X is the chapter where your current save file was created. That variable is then handed off to the drawText function, which adds that text to the screen over the stats menu in the light world. This is an area where even the Deltarune wiki is slightly inaccurate. It reads, a file is continued from chapter 1 into chapter 2 displays since chapter 1 in the top right part of the menu. The variable internally used to track this is referenced as Kris Preservation Society. But the variable which tracks the chapter a file was created in is the global flag number 914. Kris Preservation Society is just a temporary variable that holds the full string after flag 914 gets read. It's then immediately discarded and never used again. When the menu is reopened later, flag 914 is read again, and a new Kris Preservation Society temporary variable is created. That's not at all intended to be a knock on the wiki. This is how I've seen pretty much everyone refer to the KPS variable, and I think the distinction is important. I'll once again bring up the example of variable A and also the Euroboss variable. These are both local, temporary variables which are used for a very specific short-term task and then discarded. These are the types of variables which are most commonly given names which don't well describe their usage because they're not used elsewhere. It isn't important for someone working on the code to know at a glance what the Euroboss variable does, because it's only used within the context of its specific little chunk of code, and if you're already looking there, then you can just look at the code to understand what it's doing. These are the variables which can be jokey and unserious because even though it'd technically be better code practice to give them proper names that describe their purpose, giving them one-off temporary sounding names can properly communicate to someone else, or to yourself in the future, working on the code that this variable isn't all that important. It's not meant to be used elsewhere, it's not a permanent data structure that you can call elsewhere, it's just a random math variable A that's used in this chunk of code and nowhere else. That is the same vibe I get from the Kris Preservation Society. If it weren't for its name, this would just be another random temp variable X in the code, with the same level of ephemerality as any other, and it does kind of read like a joke. The Kris Preservation Society, which tells the player how long this Kris save file has been preserved. It feels like, to me, if there were an intended deeper meaning, it'd be more likely that it would have been added to the global variables, like how you can see in the same script as the KPS variable Kris's XP, gold, and stats are. A global.Kris Preservation Society instead of a random flag number. That's not to say that there's no significance. It is the only one of these lines in the stats screen which is first assigned to a local variable and then drawn to the screen, which does make it look a bit more intentionally placed by having it stand out amongst the others, but I do think that compared to the Toriel variable, KPS is substantially less significant and gives us a lot less to go on. Kris and Ralsei aren't safe. For this one, I'm entering full debunk mode. Unlike Kris Preservation Society, which at least has a little bit of mystery attached, the Kris and Ralsei aren't safe variables are completely and totally nothing, along with the actual variable, not all characters are safe. I'm not sure how prevalent these are anymore, since, like I said, there's a completely mundane explanation for these, but I've seen them brought up occasionally, and the Reddit thread referring to them is still the first result, for me at least, when searching up info about the Kris Preservation Society. To start with, Kris isn't safe and Ralsei isn't safe are not and were not ever variables, and in the current version of the game, these lines do not exist at all. In version 1.00 of Chapter 2, two debug messages were present that stated Kris isn't safe and Ralsei isn't safe. These sorts of messages are used by developers to verify that certain code is being called and ensuring that the game is working as expected. In some version after 1.00, these messages were removed, presumably either due to these misconceptions from the community or simply to clean up the number of debug messages that weren't needed. So when did they appear? In this little block of code here, you can see their relationship to this variable, not all characters are safe, which still exists in today's current version of Chapter 2. But that's still a pretty ominous sounding name too, right? There's got to be something significant here, right? No. In this case, this is a variable that's deceptively ominous, but is actually describing something very, very mundane. In Chapter 2, during the Acid Tunnel of Love sequence, you have this bridge swapping portion. And what happens when one of the characters is standing on a bridge that can be swapped on or off? Then the variable ticks above 0, marking that one or more of the characters isn't safe and is on one of the bridges. Why does that need to be checked? Because if either of the characters isn't safe, the game needs to play this little cutscene which recenters Kris and Ralsei together in the same place, back on solid ground, so that this doesn't happen. And that is all for part 1. If you can think of any other code-related rumors, leave them in the comments or mention them in the Discord.